The radar contact did not look important at first. That was the first mistake. Over the Pacific at night, small things often lied. A weak return on a scope, a signal too thin to feel urgent, a contact that looked more like scattered noise than an attack. The operators had seen false echoes before. Bad air could smear a screen. Distance could flatten danger. Fatigue could make a real threat feel ordinary. But this contact kept moving, steady, deliberate, and inbound. Somewhere beyond the black edge of vision, Japanese bombers were coming again. Not in daylight, where a formation could be read with the eye. Not under a bright sky where numbers, altitude, and spacing revealed themselves early. This was night, and night made everything worse. It hid approach, delayed reaction, and let bombers reach a target before defenders fully understood what they were facing. That was why the P-61 Black Widow was in the air. It was not a graceful fighter. It was not built for daylight legend. It was built for hunting in darkness, where crews fought with instruments first and eyesight second. Long, heavy, and armed with radar, the Black Widow belonged to a different kind of air war. One where the enemy might be close enough to kill you while still invisible beyond the canopy. The crew sent up that night knew only the essentials. Unknown aircraft inbound, Japanese, likely bombers. Numbers uncertain, altitude uncertain, intentions obvious. Behind them lay the American perimeter, runway, fuel, parked aircraft, mechanics, tents, and men on the ground who could do nothing if the bombers arrived undisturbed. A night raid did not need perfection to be dangerous. It only needed enough order to reach the target and release cleanly. So the mission was not simply interception. It was interruption. That difference mattered. In daylight combat, a pilot can think in angles, speed, and visible reaction. At night, the problem begins earlier. First, you have to find the enemy. Then close on him without losing position in the dark. Then attack without revealing yourself too soon. A night fighter does not begin with gunfire. It begins with reconstruction, building a battle out of fragments. Inside the P-61, that process had already begun. Range, bearing, correction, another correction. The radar operator worked the returns while the pilot held the aircraft steady through a sky that gave almost nothing back. Ahead of them, the Japanese force kept coming with the confidence darkness often gave bombers. Night had protected many raids before. It blurred numbers, confused defenders, and let crews believe they could reach the target before anyone truly found them. The Black Widow's job was to take that confidence away. As the range tightened, the picture became worse. This was not one bomber, then not two, then more. The screen began revealing a cluster large enough to change the pressure inside the cockpit. Several Japanese bombers were coming in together, spread just enough to complicate interception, close enough to remain dangerous, and still far enough from the target that a delayed attack might leave them time to recover. That changed everything. A lone raider could be hunted. A small bomber group in darkness was another problem entirely. At night, formations could stay dangerous longer than people imagined. In daylight, panic spreads visually. Smoke, fire, drifting aircraft, sudden breaks in line, all of it can be read instantly by the crews around it, but darkness muffles chaos. A bomber can be hit, veer away, even burn, and nearby crews may still not fully understand what happened in time to react correctly, which meant the first attack had to count, not because it needed to destroy the whole raid, because it needed to create uncertainty. That was the hidden rule of night interception. Sometimes the goal was not maximum destruction. It was to break confidence, make one crew turn, make another hesitate, force spacing to unravel, disturb timing. A raid did not have to be annihilated to fail. It only had to stop behaving like a coordinated weapon. The P-61 kept closing. At first the enemy was only electronic fact, marks on a scope, judged by skill and nerve. Then the body sensed it before the eyes could confirm it. That was how night combat often felt, danger becoming real in the mind before it became visible in the sky. Then, finally there, a shape, not fully seen, more guessed. Then another, then more. Japanese bombers. Close now. Japanese bombers. Close. The lead aircraft had not seen the Black Widow. That was the advantage radar created. The P-61 had reached firing position before the bombers could prepare for it. In daylight, a formation might already have begun weaving or scanning for attack. At night, surprise landed harder. Calm could become violence in an instant. The pilot held fire. That took discipline. Distance lies in darkness. Fire too early, and the tracers warn everyone before they do real damage. Fire too late, and you overshoot into black, empty air. So the pilot waited, steady and cold, while the gap collapsed into that narrow moment where surprise and accuracy briefly became the same thing. Then the guns opened. The first burst ripped into the nearest bomber with a violence the darkness only amplified. Tracers tore forward. The bomber's outline became visible for one brutal second. Impacts hammered across engine and fuselage. Fire streamed backward. The aircraft lurched out of line so suddenly that the bomber beside it had to shift away to avoid drifting into it. That was the first crack, and it mattered at once. The Japanese formation did not simply continue untouched. In daylight, crews might have read the damage quickly. At night, uncertainty spread faster than facts. Was it fighter attack, engine failure, collision? They could not know immediately, and in combat, not knowing is often worse than knowing the truth. The P-61 did not stay with the target. That decision mattered too. A lesser crew might have chased the damaged bomber for the certainty of a clean kill, but a bomber already falling away was no longer the heart of the mission. The raid itself still lived. Other aircraft were still pressing forward. If the Black Widow wasted precious time finishing a cripple, the rest might regain order and continue toward the field. So they ignored the easiest target and went after the formation. That was the decision that turned a successful attack into something more dangerous. The P-61 was no longer just hunting in darkness. It was dismantling the raid in the exact order that mattered most. Behind the first damaged bomber, the others were still trying to hold line, still trying to keep the approach intact, still trying to act like a weapon instead of a collection of frightened crews flying through black air. But now they knew something they had not known a minute earlier. They were not alone in the night, and somewhere just beyond their line of sight, the Black Widow was already moving into position for the second attack. They were not alone in the night. That realization changed the raid before the Black Widow fired again. A bomber crew can endure danger it understands. Flak from below, tracers from a visible fighter, even daylight interception has a kind of brutal clarity to it. But night is different. At night, the mind does half the enemy's work. One bomber drops burning out of line, and every crew still holding course is forced to ask the same question: where is he now? That was the wound the first pass had left behind. The damaged Japanese bomber was already falling away, fire trailing unevenly through the dark. The crews around it could see just enough to know something terrible had happened, but not enough to understand how the attack had come together or from what direction it might return. That uncertainty spread faster than flame. The P-61 had not simply struck an aircraft. It had cracked the formation's trust in the darkness around it. Inside the Black Widow, there was no time to admire the result. The crew were already rebuilding the picture. Range. Another contact. Then another. The surviving bombers were still moving toward the American perimeter, still dangerous, still carrying enough weight to turn one quiet airfield into wreckage if they reached it in good order. A single success meant nothing if the rest of the raid recovered. That was why the pilot ignored the crippled bomber. It was the easiest target in the sky. A weaker crew might have gone after the certainty of a clean second burst, finishing what had already been broken. But the mission was not behind them. It was ahead. The falling bomber was no longer the center of the problem. The raid itself still lived. So the Black Widow turned away from the wounded aircraft and went after the formation. That decision mattered, because this second attack would not be built on surprise alone. The Japanese bombers were alert now in the way bombers become alert at night. Tense, searching, trying to hold course while expecting violence from a direction they could not predict. That made them more dangerous. It also made them more fragile. Men braced too tightly in darkness often react badly when the next shock finally lands. The P-61 closed again. Outside the canopy, the sky remained almost blank, giving back only fragments of shape and motion. The pilot trusted the instruments, trusted the man guiding him in, trusted the slow construction of a firing solution from information that would have meant nothing to an ordinary fighter crew. That was what separated a night hunter from every daylight pilot who thought combat began with sight. Then the next bomber appeared, larger now, closer. The pilot waited one breath longer, then fired. The burst tore through the bomber's side and engine with a violence the darkness somehow amplified. Tracers dragged the target into visibility for a second, and then fire followed. The aircraft rolled out of line hard enough that another bomber nearby had to break away to avoid crossing into it. What had been one wound in the formation became two. Now the raid had a different problem. One damaged bomber can be dismissed as bad luck. Two aircraft hit in separate passes by an enemy nobody can clearly track feels like something worse. It feels like control slipping, not all at once, not dramatically, but enough to infect every crew still trying to preserve discipline. And at night, infection spreads quickly. The surviving bombers reacted in different ways. Some tightened their spacing, hoping closeness might feel safer. Others drifted wider, each crew trying not to become the next invisible target. Both choices created danger. Tightening meant one damaged aircraft could disrupt the next. Opening up made individual bombers easier to isolate. Either way, the formation was losing smoothness, and smoothness was exactly what bombing required. The Black Widow vanished again before return fire could settle properly. That too was part of the craft. Night fighting punishes greed. Stay too long after the pass and the enemy finally reads your path. Chase too deep into the bomber stream and darkness that protected your approach becomes darkness that swallows your escape. The P-61 crew disappeared, and forced the Japanese to keep searching for a hunter that refused to remain visible long enough to solve. By now, the bombers should have been preparing mentally for target approach, release timing, and attack geometry. Instead, they were thinking about survival. That was the real effect of the second strike. A bomber crew focused on survival is no longer fully focused on mission. The aircraft still moves forward. The formation may still hold together in appearance. But something vital has shifted. Small corrections become rougher. Timing loses confidence. Men hold steady when they should adjust, then overcorrect when they finally do. Inside the Black Widow, the radar picture confirmed it. The Japanese were still inbound, but no longer clean. The pattern had begun to stretch. Spacing was less certain. Some bombers were compensating for damage around them. Others were flying with that rigid caution that usually comes just before formation discipline starts to crack. The raid still had numbers. It still had bombs. But it no longer had calm. Then came the moment that pushed the battle further. Another bomber contact sat slightly offset from the others, not fully separated, but distinct enough to matter. It suggested the raid still had structure left. Still enough order that one part of it might survive, even if another had already been shaken. That meant the Black Widow could not stop now. If the Japanese regained confidence, the field behind the Americans would pay for every lost second. Again the crew turned. Again they rebuilt the attack from fragments. That was the hidden strength of the P-61. It was not just armed. It was patient. It could reconstruct combat inside darkness. Then deliver violence exactly where confusion was already weakening the enemy. When the next bomber finally appeared, it was too late for its crew to prepare. The Black Widow came in from a slightly different angle this time. That change mattered. Once men begin expecting danger from one direction, they brace against memory rather than reality. Shift the line of attack and fear arrives fresh. The bomber crossed the P-61's sight for an instant. Enough. The pilot fired. The burst raked through fuselage and inner wing. Sparks flashed first, then a deeper glow. The bomber shuddered, dropped speed, and began falling away from the others with unmistakable damage. This time, the nearby aircraft did not even try to pretend the formation was stable. It turned off early, breaking alignment just to escape the same fate. That was the third strike, and now the raid was no longer simply disturbed. It was starting to come apart. 3 bombers hit in darkness by an attacker that kept appearing, firing, and disappearing again was more than physical damage. It was a message. The sky itself had turned hostile. The bombers were no longer just flying toward a target. They were flying through a space controlled by an enemy they could not properly see, predict, or answer. The Japanese formation still existed, but it no longer trusted the night. And once a bomber force loses that trust, one more pass can do more than destroy another aircraft. It can convince the survivors that the mission is already slipping out of their hands. The Japanese formation still existed, but it no longer trusted the night. That was the real turning point of the battle. Bombers can survive damage. They can even survive losses. What they struggle to survive is doubt. Once crews stop believing the darkness belongs to them, every mile to the target feels longer, every correction feels dangerous, and every shadow ahead starts looking like the next attack. Inside the Black Widow, the crew understood that the fight had entered its final phase. The first pass had shocked the raid. The second had damaged its confidence. The third had begun pulling its structure apart. Now came the hardest part, making sure the Japanese never put it back together. That was more dangerous than it sounded. A formation under pressure often becomes most lethal in its last attempt to recover. Men who have been surprised once become cautious. Men who have been hit twice become nervous. But men who realize the whole mission is slipping away can become desperate. And desperate crews sometimes hold tighter, fire sooner, and cling to discipline with a kind of stubbornness that makes them dangerous one final time. The Black Widow turned again. There was no clean drama in it, no elegant sweep through moonlight, no clear line between hunter and hunted. Only darkness, instruments, voices kept calm by training, and the heavy certainty that somewhere ahead were still living bombers trying to reach the American field before fear defeated them completely. The radar picture was no longer neat. Contacts that had once moved with the logic of a strike package were now slightly uneven, the spacing rougher, the alignment less confident. Some bombers were still pressing ahead. Others had drifted just enough to show the strain. The Japanese had not abandoned the mission yet. That mattered. A wounded raid is still a raid until it breaks, so the crew chose the point that mattered most. Not the bomber most visibly damaged, not the nearest shape. The one still trying to hold the center together. That choice defined the ending of the battle. Big air attacks survive chaos only if some aircraft continue behaving as anchors. As long as one bomber or one element still flies with enough steadiness to preserve rhythm, the others have something to cling to. Break that anchor, and the whole formation stops acting like a weapon. The pilot closed carefully. By now the Japanese knew something was out there hunting them, and the risk of a blind defensive burst or sudden evasive turn was far higher than before. One wrong approach could put the Black Widow in front of desperate gunners, or carry it too deep into confusion with too little room to recover. This final pass had to be controlled, not reckless. Then the shape appeared, a dark mass against black air, still flying too steadily, still trying to preserve the approach. The pilot held for a second that must have felt longer than it was, then fired. The guns hit with brutal clarity. Tracers cut the dark, found metal, and turned uncertainty into violence. The bomber's outline flashed into view under impact. The burst hammered through engine and fuselage. Fire spilled back. The aircraft dropped out of line with unmistakable damage, and the effect on the rest was immediate. Another bomber broke away too early. A third drifted off its path. What remained of the formation's center no longer looked stable. That was the fourth bomber, and that was the breaking point. The raid had not been annihilated in some blazing theatrical collapse. It had been stripped of order piece by piece. First surprise, then pressure, then repeated disruption at exactly the places where timing depended on steadiness. The Japanese still had aircraft in the sky, but they no longer had the clean, confident approach a bombing attack required. Their line was stretched, their rhythm damaged, and their crews were now flying through fear instead of through plan. That was enough, because bombing depends on more than bombs. It depends on sequence, on confidence, on the ability to arrive over a target in something close to control. And the Black Widow had taken that away. The surviving Japanese crews now faced the worst decision a strike force can face in darkness. Press on while shaken and risk wasting the whole attack under continued interception, or break the run and save what remained. Either choice meant failure in the only way that mattered. The mission was no longer unfolding as intended. The raid that had entered the night as a weapon was now behaving like a damaged collection of separate crews, each more concerned with surviving the next minute than finishing the attack. That was how air combat changed. Not because the P-61 had simply shot down aircraft, because it proved something larger. Until then, many still thought of night air war as a looser, uglier cousin of daylight combat. More confusion, less control, fewer chances to shape a battle with precision. The Black Widow destroyed that idea. What happened in this fight showed that radar-guided interception could do more than find bombers in darkness. It could dismantle an attack intelligently, systematically, and before the enemy ever reached proper striking rhythm. Night no longer belonged automatically to the bomber. It could belong to the hunter. And once that truth became real, air combat was never quite the same again. The Japanese formation turned away in fragments of lost order, its surviving aircraft no longer pressing with the same confidence they had carried into the black sky. The American field behind the P-61 remained standing because the attack had been broken before it could become precise. That was the real victory, not a dramatic count alone, not the image of fire in the dark. The true success was that the raid failed to land as intended. One aircraft had changed the terms of the fight. The P-61 had entered the night not as a faster bomber-destroyer, not as a lucky interceptor, but as something much more important, proof that darkness itself could be mastered. Radar, timing, patience, and controlled violence had combined into a new kind of aerial power. The enemy had come expecting concealment. Instead, concealment had been turned against them, and that was the lesson. The Black Widow did not need to destroy every bomber in the sky. It only needed to destroy the way they worked together. Once that happened, the raid stopped being a strike and became a retreat waiting to admit itself. The P-61 changed the battle by attacking the raid's structure, not just its aircraft. It used radar, surprise, and repeated disruption to hit 4 Japanese bombers at the exact points where formation confidence depended on control. That was the difference. The Black Widow did not win because night hit it. It won because it proved night could now be owned.